Welcome to my lesson. Today's lesson is different approaches to the study of psychology. Different approaches to the study of psychology. So our lesson will be guided by the following learning outcomes. We'll look at neurological approach, behavioral approach, cognitive approach, psychoanalytic approach, and phenology or humanistic approach. So coming to neurological approach, in this approach, human beings attempt to relate their actions to events taking place inside the body, and particularly with the brain and the nervous system. So this approach has got a lot to do with the activities that occurs in the brain and the nervous system. Then in this approach, psychologists look at the central nervous system, that is the brain, the spinal cord, and the chemical processes which indicate certain mental activities and behavior in human beings. So this approach, in addition to that, this approach it seeks to establish the relationship between biochemical processes in the nervous system and the behavior. So in other words, we can say that this approach it looks at the relationship between the activity that occurs in the brain, in the nervous system, with the behavior of a person. For instance, if an individual, if a part of a brain of an individual is damaged, it will be seen in the way that individual will be behaving. So there's a relationship between the functions, the chemical processes in the nervous system and the behavior of an individual. Let us move on and look at behavioral approach. So in this approach, studies, let me say this approach it studies behavior rather than the internal working of an organism. For example, the previous approach we looked at, it looks at the internal functions in the brain in relation to behavior. But coming to this approach, which is behavioral approach, this approach it studies observable behavior. So it looks at what's happening on the outside of an individual rather than what is happening inside the individual. So for this reason, it is called the black box of approach. Why is it called a black box of approach? It's because it is called a black box of approach as it blacks out the inward mental processes of organism by looking at the external behavior of an individual. Which means, in other words, we can say it overlooks. It doesn't concentrate on what occurs inward in the mental processes of an individual, but it looks at the outward activities of an individual. So in short, we can say it focuses on the behavior, observable behavior of an organism. But again, for this one, you really have to be careful because at times you may not have concrete information about an individual just by observing their behavior, because at times people behave differently, and the behavior of the person at times might not depict what's inside. A person can be behaving as if everything is okay whilst they're having a lot of challenges. So when you're using this approach, you really have to take your time. You really have to take your time to observe so that you come up with concrete information. Then the other approach is cognitive approach. So for this one, we can start by defining what cognition is. So cognition refers to the mental processes of perception, memory, and information processing by which knowledge is acquired and problems are solved. So what is this approach all about? This approach it comes from the belief that we are not merely passive receptors of a stimuli. And this approach, in addition to that, this approach is concerned with the mind, the inside activities, information processes of an individual. So coming to psychoanalytic or psychosexual approach, um, let me say this approach was developed by Sigmund Freud, whose assumption is that much of our behavior, it comes from the processes that are unconscious. For instance, fear and wishes. These they influence our behavior. In addition to that, it argues that our behavior is influenced by our unconscious processes, fears, thoughts that one is not even aware of. So certain things that we're not even aware of in our unconscious minds, they influence our behavior. We can also say that this psychoanalytic approach or psychosexual approach, it focuses on the needs and desires, certain needs and desires. For instance, it focuses on sex and aggression. Moving on to structure or introspective approach. This approach, it argues that cultural influences affect the way we behave. Cultural influences affect the way we behave. And it also looks at the inner parts. The inner part of each person, as it looks at the inner feelings of the people as individuals. So for this one, it says that our culture, it influences the way we feel about ourselves. It influences the way we feel. No wonder it is called introspective approach, because it causes one to look into their deeper feelings within themselves. So culture influences the way a person feels. It influences the inner feelings that we have as individuals. So moving on to phenomenology, um, this approach is also referred to as a humanistic approach because it centers on human beings. So because it centers on human beings, it is also called the humanistic approach. So this approach, it focuses on a person's subjective viewpoint, which is the person's own interpretation of events. And psychologists use this approach and believe that we are all responsible for our actions so long as we are not acted upon beyond our control. So this approach, it is concerned with an individual's own perception and interpretation of events. So these are the major approaches to the study of psychology. Thank you very much for your time. Stay blessed.